On my 35th birthday, my husband didn't just abandon me, he staged my humiliation like a grand finale. In front of 17 of his wealthy colleagues, he called me a disgrace, tossed his linen napkin onto the table, and walked out, leaving me with a $3,847 bill. His final words cut sharper than crystal. "A woman like you should be grateful I even looked your way." I didn't break. I didn't beg. I smiled, quietly, deliberately, because what he didn't know was that his carefully crafted empire was already cracking beneath him. And I was holding the hammer. By sunrise, my phone would be buzzing with 23 missed calls, each one more desperate than the last. That night at Montclair, Daniel's words rang through the chandelier-lit dining room with surgical cruelty. He never spilled a drop of champagne as he left me behind. But he didn't notice who else at that table was watching. 2 hours earlier, I had been smoothing my grandmother's coral lipstick in the mirror, foolishly telling myself this birthday might be different. That maybe Daniel would remember the girl I once was, before the bonuses, before the partnership, before I became a silent accessory in his theater of wealth. There was a time when Daniel didn't look through me. Before partnerships and press releases, before the suits got tailored and I started eating dinner alone. It was spring, a bookstore in Midtown. I had just read a passage from a dog-eared poetry book out loud to myself, out loud but softly, and Daniel, standing nearby, repeated the last line back to me, word for word, like he'd been waiting to finish it for me. That night, we walked 3 miles with coffee gone cold in our hands. He told me I was luminous. Not beautiful, luminous. I clung to that version of him for longer than I care to admit. I folded that moment like a keepsake and tucked it somewhere behind the versions of him I didn't recognize anymore. Somewhere between his 3rd promotion and my 4th missed anniversary, that man disappeared. But sometimes, in the mirror, I searched my face for the woman he once saw. But to understand how carefully he engineered my downfall, you have to start with the beginning of that day, back when the morning still carried promise. Before I realized I was stepping into a trap designed by the man who claimed to love me. 97. After my husband publicly called me a disgrace, I found his secret bank accounts. My 3rd grade classroom was its own small, stubborn universe, one where I was still Maya Carter, not Mrs. Reed, and where glitter could outshine marble any day. That room kept the real me alive. 28 chaotic desks, walls crowded with times tables and lopsided drawings of families, and kid-made tributes that meant more than any dinner party could buy. The 28 construction paper cards with glitter glued into every crease would become a tiny museum of proof that my life had value far beyond a ledger. Janet's cautious, teacherly look in the lounge would later mean more than sympathy. It would point me back to what actually mattered. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Reed." The room erupted the moment I stepped through the door, Sophia flinging herself at my legs, a dozen small voices belting out a hymn of crayons and confidence. Michael, proud as a rooster, presented his calendar with today circled in red, and a chorus of 8-year-old detectives claimed credit for the surprise. 28 handmade cards followed me to my desk. Glitter, misspellings, wildly proportioned portraits of me. Sometimes I had 7 arms, sometimes none, but every single one stitched me back together. This was a kind of wealth Daniel would never understand, the kind that couldn't be banked or bragged about. At lunch, while the kids thudded around on the blacktop, I picked at the cafeteria salad. $3 worth of lettuce that somehow tasted richer than the $40 appetizers at his favorite restaurants. Janet sat across from me, her fork pausing between bites. She offered the kind of quiet counsel only teachers know how to give, and she remarked, in that careful voice, that birthdays had a way of revealing what people were actually willing to do. Later, I changed into a red dress Daniel hadn't pre-approved, a knee-length thing I'd bought years before, when I still dressed for joy rather than for status. In the mirror, I smoothed on my grandmother's coral lipstick and remembered the names we were about to see. Monique's husband ran a hedge fund Daniel wanted to touch, and Evelyn's family could open doors all the way up the Northeast Corridor. Those names meant access. They meant a calendar of favors I hadn't signed up for. At the restaurant, their smiles fell into place like masks. "Maya, how lovely," Monique trilled, air-kissing near my ear. "That dress is so cheerful." Evelyn added a thin, sympathetic laugh and mentioned, casually, that last month I'd suggested a fundraiser for public school teachers, as if charity and philanthropy were interchangeable props in their social theater. Their little barbs landed with precision, each one a delicate scalpel. I retreated to the bathroom and sat fully clothed on the closed toilet lid for 20 minutes, staring at a wine stain on the tile that looked for all the world like a bruise. My hands were steady enough to photograph everything: receipts, reservation notes, the faint creases in Daniel's cuff. I made a folder on my phone labeled tax documents because it felt safer to name the thing that frightened me. When I left the stall, I slid the receipt back into his suit pocket exactly where I'd found it, hung the jacket with its cufflinks and quiet sins, and then spent an hour in the guest bathroom, retching until my body rejected a truth my mind was only beginning to catalog. That night, Daniel came home smelling of airports that didn't exist. He kissed my forehead with the kind of mouth that lied easily, murmuring something about delayed flights and difficult clients. His words felt like props, lines rehearsed for a play he thought I'd never stop watching. I parked in the school lot long after the sun had slipped behind the trees. The engine hummed in neutral. My phone lit up with Daniel's message. "Dinner's waiting." I didn't move. I couldn't. I stared at the brick wall outside my classroom like it owed me something, like it might tell me who I used to be before all this. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. I wanted my name back. I wanted silence that didn't feel like punishment. For a second, I thought maybe I should just leave. Let him keep the money, the house, the narrative. Start over in a town where no one knew how many chances I'd already given. But then, I imagined my students asking why I left mid-year. I imagined Sophia's handmade card, the one where I had 7 arms and a smile big enough to split my face in 2. I didn't want revenge, but I couldn't let the lie be the last word. A few nights later, he showed up with tulips, my favorite. He also brought home tiramisu from the little Italian place near the school, the one he used to call our spot. He said he'd been thinking about us, that maybe we needed to get away, that he missed how we used to laugh. For a second, just a flicker, I believed him. I even smiled. Then, while clearing the kitchen counter, I found the florist's note still tucked in the delivery box. "To Christine, every Thursday feels new." I stared at it until the letters stopped making sense. He hadn't just recycled the gift. He'd forgotten where he'd sent it first. That wasn't a peace offering. It was a rerun. And I had already seen how this episode ended. 3 weeks later, the play ended. At a teachers' conference in Albany, my colleague introduced me to her sister Claire, a woman who carried truth the way some people carry knives, sharp, steady, and ready. Claire didn't just help me because she could. She helped me because someone once stood by and watched her drown. "Gavin ruined me," she said calmly over diner coffee. "But Ethan built it." He coached Gavin what to say, which doctors to name, how to make me look hysterical in court. She tapped her folder and slid it across the table. I have the emails, she said. I have the billing slips. He charged my ex 50 grand to dismantle me. Her voice never shook, but her hands did. Helping me wasn't charity. It was justice. Served cold and shared. Over bitter conference coffee, Claire told me to bring 3 bank statements to a cafe on Elm Street after school. She promised they would reveal more about my life than Daniel ever had. Her warning clung to me like static. If you can access them safely. Safely. That word would echo later, when I had 40 minutes before Daniel returned from racquetball. That afternoon, I slid through his filing system with hands that looked calm but weren't. I printed statements from our joint accounts, photographed them as backup, and felt my stomach turn as the numbers blurred together. Deposits I didn't recognize, withdrawals I couldn't trace. Weeks later, Claire unfolded her laptop between us like a magician setting out her stage. Let me show you something about patterns. For an hour, she turned transactions into confessions. Jewelry store charges disguised as business expenses, lingerie receipts labeled as client gifts, monthly transfers to an account that didn't belong to us at all. Daniel was bleeding $12,000 a month into someone else's life. By the time I returned home, the anger inside me had crystallized. At dinner, I sliced my chicken with surgical precision and murmured casually, Marcus's new Porsche is beautiful. Metallic blue suits him. Daniel's fork froze midair. He had told me Marcus was still leasing a car. My lie slid in easily, laced with just enough truth to make him choke. That night, I stood at the mirror fastening my grandmother's emerald earrings, my reflection pale against the red dress Daniel had never chosen for me. My phone buzzed. Running late. Meet you there. Of course. Making an entrance was more important than arriving with his wife. At Le Montclair, the maitre d' led me to my seat, not at the head, not beside the empty chair saved for Daniel, but 3 seats down, wedged between people who didn't bother to ask my name. Across from me, Amber Lawson adjusted her neckline and smiled like a predator, scenting weakness. Her words, delivered with surgical grace, cut through the wine and candlelight. Little jabs, mocking asides, jokes sharp enough to draw blood. The table followed her lead. This wasn't dinner. It was sport. And Daniel's empty chair was their permission slip. When he finally arrived, 40 minutes late and reeking of whiskey and perfume, the table erupted in applause. He didn't look at me. He never did. Later, when the leather billfold landed on the table and Daniel's insults hung in the air like smoke, I whispered the question that had been burning my tongue for months. If I'm such an embarrassment, why did you marry me? His answer was cruel enough to silence even the table. Because I thought I could fix you. Polish you up. Teach you how to belong. But class isn't something you learn. You're still the same small town nobody I found. Hours later, Daniel was unconscious in his leather chair, the empty bottle beside him. I texted Claire. 20 minutes later, she slipped through my front door like a shadow carrying a laptop bag. How long will he be out? She whispered. 3 hours, maybe more, I said. She sat up at his desk, her fingers flying. He's been moving money for months, she murmured, eyes narrowing at the screen. Then she leaned back, tapped the spacebar, and delivered the words that cracked his empire wide open. He's sloppy. These transfers are from client accounts. Offshore routing. That's not just betrayal. That's wire fraud. The next morning, I dialed the number Marco had pressed into my palm and tucked into his coat, and he answered on the first ring. What followed moved this from a private wound into an institutional reckoning. Footage, testimony, and paper trails began to line up like witnesses. The woman at the cafe would slide a folder across the table and hand me proof that went far beyond betrayal. Those documents would force more than a divorce. They would draw lines on maps lawyers couldn't ignore, and reporters who loved a scandal. "Mrs. Lane, I was hoping you'd call," Marco said, his accent thick and steady over the wire. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded ready. He said the words that made my chilled fingers loosen. Multiple angles, clear views, a dining room camera that had caught everything. I met with Claire, the sister my colleague had introduced me to at the conference, in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and paperbacks. She was all brisk confidence, direct eyes, a clipped laugh, and hands that moved like someone used to handling other people's secrets. Without preamble, she slid a manila folder toward me. "Gavin ruined me in our divorce," she said, voice measured, "but Ethan built it." He coached Gavin on what to say, which doctors to name, how to script instability. I have the emails. Her hands were perfectly steady as she pushed proof across the table. Inside the folder were invoices and receipts and the kind of notes that read like a criminal ledger. There was a billing for $50,000, a fee to destroy someone's life. There were monthly siphons from client accounts disguised as fees, transfers routed through shell companies, and credit card charges that matched nights at La Perla and other places that weren't ours. Claire tapped the screen and said quietly, "We have enough." Claire made the legal checklist for me. Financial crimes, documented adultery with timestamps, emotional abuse captured on video, and even a paper trail that suggested conspiracy to commit perjury. Any single item could trigger a moral turpitude clause in a prenup. Together, they looked like a wrecking ball, so I mailed the packages myself. I stood at the courthouse-style drop-off, watching the clerk scan each envelope stamped to SEC, IRS, State Attorney General. The postal clerk glanced up, asked gently if it was your first time doing this. I lied and said no. I needed to file some reports. He nodded, like people who regularize chaotic things do. "There's a coffee cart on the second floor. They'll take care of you." I walked out with stamped receipts in my hand and a rising sense that the world had shifted by an inch. When investigators started to call, when women began to show up with their own stories and receipts, the threads began to knot. "Look at this statement," Nora said, leaning over my shoulder as she zoomed in on a tablet. "Dinner for 4 at 11 Madison Park. Ethan, Marcus, your husband, George, and someone named Christine." She pointed to dates, cross-referenced calendars. The breathing in the room changed. It got quick and thin. The Morrison account alone spelled headlines. I asked for time. Wednesday morning, first edition. 48 hours to press and prepare, to give the journalists and the attorneys space to lock the narrative before the hounds descended. They agreed. By lunch the next day, the story would be everywhere. When the morning broadcast hit the hotel TV, Claire knocked softly on my door with 2 steaming cups. "You might want to see this," she said. The anchor kept his practiced calm, but his eyes were bright. The chyron read, "Federal investigators raid Mitchell, Sterling, and Company." Early this morning, agents removed boxes and hard drives. The image cut to men in suits carrying sealed evidence. I watched Ethan emerge from our driveway like someone cut out of a magazine and left in a storm. Suit rumpled, hair wild, face unshaved. He looked small and enormous at once. Emma, our neighbor, placed a cup of coffee in my hands and said quietly, "Stay upstairs." I'll handle it, but I needed to see him. I needed to stand just out of sight at the top of the stairs and watch the man who'd humiliated me become the man I'd watched collapse in my head so many nights. When he pounded on the front door, his voice ragged and raw, the threats spilled out like always. "When I fix this, she'll pay. I'll ruin her." I'll make sure she never teaches again. He rattled off every vindictive promise he'd rehearsed, and then, quieter, desperate. She's not your wife anymore. She's just Ava Lane, the woman who finally remembered her worth. By mid-morning, Marco texted a photo of Montclair's reservation ledger. 17 names in Daniel's handwriting, my seat marked at the far end like a spotlight on a stage he'd designed for my humiliation. Every line confirmed what my bones already knew. He hadn't lost control in a moment. He'd choreographed it with the precision of a balance sheet. The dining room had not been unanimous. Someone had watched with compassion that night and would speak when it mattered. This was the last time my value would be measured by his table settings. The next ledger with my name on it would be my freedom. I ran my finger over Daniel's cramped notes, seating critical, place Maya at end, and felt the old heat rise, then pass. The evidence was cold and clean. When I returned to Montclair a few days later to settle a lingering detail, an elderly woman at a corner table touched my sleeve. "I was here on your birthday," she said softly. "Everyone saw what he did. The way you paid that bill with your head high, remarkable." Her husband nodded, hands folded around his coffee. "We've been married 53 years, he said. Not once has she had to question her worth. That's love. What you lived through wasn't love. That was possession." The words landed like balm over a bruise. Soon after, in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper, Daniel stared at the divorce decree as if it were a misprint. If I'd stayed quiet, he would have buried me under stories of instability, signed away my pension, and rewritten my life in footnotes. "You destroyed me," he said, eyes fixed on the signature line. "I gave you everything." I kept my voice level. "You took everything and convinced me I should be grateful for the loss." His lawyer nudged the final page forward. Daniel scrawled his name, shoved back his chair, and paused in the doorway. "You'll never be anybody without me." I met his gaze. "I was always somebody. You just needed me to forget it." Monday arrived like a clean page. My alarm sang at 6 for the first time in a week. I pulled on my favorite cardigan, the one with the coffee ring from an overexcited hug, and drove to Brookfield Elementary, feeling like I was returning from a long, necessary winter. The parking lot seemed brighter. Colleagues smiled wider. The security guard offered a salute that made me laugh. In my classroom, the old chair squeaked, the desks leaned, and 28 hands shot into the air to tell me everything I'd missed. Loose teeth, new kittens, soccer wins, and almost wins. It felt like oxygen. This was the life Daniel tried to convince me was small. It turned out to be expansive enough to hold everything I needed. The evidence proved his malice. The institutions answered. The allies appeared on time, and the red dress outlasted the black suit. I didn't rebuild by becoming someone new. I rebuilt by remembering who I already was. The ledger closed on Daniel's empire the moment I chose mine. Dignity, proof, and the classroom where my name still sounded like me. If this journey of quiet preparation and precise justice kept you locked in, tap like now. Tell me the moment that hit hardest: Marco's ledger photo, Claire's pattern reveal, or the final line across that divorce decree. For more stories of betrayal, resolve, and earned peace, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next.